things have changed a bit. So I'm going to use this video to both decorate this new wheelchair I now have, because obviously it needs to look like it fits me, and that requires various plantification and overgrowth, and also explain what happened and how this is going to change things on this channel moving forward. Because yes, disability things have changed for me, and it is going to affect things, but I'm hoping that if I figure out a good system, I'll be able to continue posting videos fairly regularly, and everything will be okay. So to start with, here's what I want to actually do to the chair, and hopefully editing me will remember to put a handy little list somewhere on the screen where it won't cover my face to show you exactly what's going down. So I'm going to be decorating the wheel spokes, I'm going to be decorating the cushion that I'm sitting on, I'm going to be adding some details to the back of the chair that are all going to be fairly removable just in case. I'm going to be adding a pair of fairy wings that are very removable with magnets to the back of the chair, and I'm going to be just generally adding some touches of moss and vines and stuff wherever it won't interfere with the mechanics, especially to cover up the logos on the chair, which I will talk about later. So yeah, let's chat about what happened, and I'll get started with decorating the wheels. Before I get into the details of what the last month and a half have been like for me, let me just quickly explain what I'm doing to the wheels, as it isn't super visible on camera. I'm just wrapping two different materials around alternating spokes. One is a vine-shaped ribbon I'm unraveling from some braided cord, and the other is a textured yarn that looks like feathery moss or lichen. Both are, of course, green. When I first started wrapping the spokes, I was using clear tape to secure both ends of the ribbon/yarn, but I pretty quickly worked out how to use knots instead so I don't have tape visible on my spokes. So what's been going on? Well, the last video I published was scheduled almost 2 weeks in advance, and by the time it was automatically posted, I was neck deep in the worst disability flare I've had yet, with both old issues and new ones taking over my life. I'd scheduled the video ahead of time because I was going on a camping event with a group of friends, so not only was I having a medical crisis, I was also having it while camping. It was not fun for anyone involved, and I still feel so guilty for the amount of help I needed from friends at what was meant to be a fun and relaxing event. It all started in the late afternoon of the second day of the event. I was shivering a little and had borrowed a hood from one of my friends at her insistence, but unfortunately the shivering had already triggered the start of a tic attack. I don't yet have a diagnosed tic disorder, although hopefully that will change soon as I pursue medical answers and specialist appointments. However, I have had periodic motor tics for years. Never to the degree I got them at this event, though. Now, my friends have been around for tic attacks before, and usually the method is to wait them out. So we did, first moving me to a less in-the-way spot, which despite my small size was a challenge as I was uncontrollably and violently kicking with recently acquired steel-toed boots, and then hanging out with me, keeping me from hyperextending my knees backwards and making sure I was hydrated. We were hoping the tics would die down. Previously, even my worst attacks wouldn't last longer than an hour. I was not so lucky that night. Eventually, I was moved further with the help of a wagon back to my campsite so I could attempt to eat some food and get some warmer layers on. I've already identified that cold is a trigger for my tics, so getting me warm was rather important, especially as there was no sign of the tics easing. Before I continue, the wheels are decorated, and with a little bit of a struggle, they are also reattached to the rest of the chair. My next task is to cover my plain black seat cushion with some mossy textured fabric, sewing it in the style of a fitted sheet to make it removable for washing. Now, back to the saga of my uncontrollable convulsing. The tics did not approve with time and warmth. In fact, they got worse. As the evening went on, people had to take shifts being someone I could lean on, mostly so that when my entire body started tensing in a way to make me look like something out of The Exorcist, I wouldn't slam my head into the ground. At one point, the Raven Cat gremlin started chanting in Latin, and then in black speech from Lord of the Rings, which amusingly made things worse. At this point, friends were calling medical hotlines to try and figure out what we might be able to do to help me. Most of the advice was go to the emergency room, but my fear of hospitals make things worse for all of us, and I did not go anywhere that night, as much as I probably should have. We did get the advice to take an allergy medicine for the use of the side effect of sleepiness, but unfortunately I have a very strong allergy to all things milk, including lactose, and lactose is a really common filler agent in pills, so despite multiple people at this event having the recommended medication, no one had one that I could safely take. In the end, I got help to bed and the tics eased from pure exhaustion enough for me to fall asleep. At this point, my legs had been continually kicking for over 4 hours, and every muscle hurt. I'd barely eaten any food as I could not safely hold anything hot, so my dinner had been cornflakes and crackers. Again, we interrupt this story to report that the chair cushion has been appropriately mossed, and I am now decorating the front of the backrest. I have 2 lengths of single chain crochet I did with my fingers off camera, and I'm sewing it in the pattern of twisting vine stems. Coming up soon, I'll be cutting out leaves from felt, embroidering them with veins, and attaching those to the stem of the vine. Finally, the elephant in the room. Yes, I am standing in this clip. I do still have the ability to stand when I'm at my baseline ability. However, I quite often fall below baseline either from my knees buckling or my legs ticking and shaking, so the wheelchair is still a necessary addition to my life. Now, back to the show. We had all hoped that I'd sleep the tic attack off, and for a few glorious minutes the next morning I thought I had. Not so. After a morning spent alternately convulsing and napping and being helpless while friends, especially the house cat, fought a windstorm that was not making anything easier to deal with, I was convinced to go to the emergency room with a friend's support and the ability to drive. It was not nearly as scary as I thought it would be. I was given some medication that hopefully would help and sent home after only an hour or so. The medication did kick in, and the ticking finally stopped. However, at this point my body was exhausted beyond coping point, and on trying to step out of the car, I fully collapsed. Now, this is also a fairly regular occurrence for me. I've been dealing with my legs randomly deciding to stop being legs for a year now, and at this point my legs deserved the break. They'd been exercising for like 10 hours over the course of 2 days. A few things were rearranged to accommodate my floppiness. I may have finally been able to keep still, but I still couldn't walk, get to the bathroom alone, and with the windstorm continuing, it was decided that I should sleep in one of the dorms available at the site, rather than in my tent. I was still desperately hoping I'd be able to stay for one more full day, but even though the medication did improve things, it was too little too late. My friends were also exhausted beyond their limits, and I was eventually taken home from the event early. It was very clear that my housemate, the house cat who was driving me home, would not have the capacity to help me in my mostly non-functional state after the event. So as we drove home, I called in help from my family. I was taken in by my aunt and uncle for the first night while my parents raced home from their own vacation. Then I was handed over to their care for the next several weeks. I was still ticking. Not as badly, and not continuously for hours, but I could still barely walk without support, and I was still twitchy and shaky. Now comes the boring part of recovery. Medical appointments, blood tests, lots of napping, new medications. I struggled for years to learn how to swallow pills, and finally, luckily, I can do it with ease. However, I'm doomed to be stuck with kids' syrup medications again, because unfortunately all the pill forms of the muscle relaxants I'm now on contain bloody lactose. Yes, I am bitter about this. Yes, I do eat gummy worms after I take the meds as a reward for swallowing the gross liquid like a good gremlin. The spark of hope in the monotony of recovery was finding this chair. And what a lucky find it was! $50 in a thrift store for a perfectly working, barely used chair that cost $2,000 new. It was distinctly too large for me, being the heavy-duty model rated for 3 times my weight, but it works, and it gives me back independence that my unpredictable disability took. Even before the nightmare of the last few weeks, I was on the lookout for a chair. This just accelerated the urgency. And of course, my first thought upon receiving the chair was, ooh, I need to decorate it. And so here we are. I gave myself time to recover before I started decorating, and waited until I was independent enough to come back to my own apartment, with my parents only a phone call away if things get worse again. And then I took the process of the decorating slowly, giving myself time and grace for when there were days that I couldn't work at all. Being disabled is exhausting sometimes. And now we come to the what happens next. I'm still in that limbo period of trying to identify all the things wrong with me, and while in the last couple of years I've made a lot of progress on that front, I still don't have all the answers, and I'm still in the process of figuring out what combination of medication, mobility aids, routines, and physiotherapy exercises will most improve my baseline ability and limit the length and intensity of my flares. At the moment, things are very dynamic. Some days I'm fine, and as long as I don't push myself, I'm close to abled. Other days I'm in enough pain that I can't stand, or my legs won't stop twitching, or my knees decide that they don't want to behave and let me be an upright creature. Up until this point, despite all my physical struggles, I've managed to maintain a fortnightly upload schedule. But with more and more variables being thrown at me, I'm not sure I can be as strict as I wish to. Going forward, I need to give myself more grace to have bad days, and more wiggle room to accommodate that. So while I'm going to try and keep to uploading every couple of weeks, it won't be a strict schedule, and there will be times where the gap between videos is longer than I'd like. Hopefully once I have more answers and methods to deal with my health, things can stabilize again. I do have some answers, which is better than a few months ago. I have hypermobile EDS and an essential tremor, which are large factors in my mobility issues. And of course, I'm also autistic and have several other mental illnesses. There's a lot going on. But I'll make it through. I have a really good support group, and as much as the last month and a bit, and honestly the last few months, have sucked, things on the whole are improving as I get more answers and more systems. Back to my crafting, and away from getting all emotional. Currently, I'm working on constructing fairy wings for the back of my chair. Since I first realized I'd eventually need a wheelchair, joking that I'd be in the chair by the time I'm 30, hi, I'm currently 21, I was a bit off in my estimate, I've been planning to put wings on it. And I've put a lot of thought into the design of these wings. The wings are made of wire wrapped in a pair of pantyhose I found ages ago at a thrift store and never got around to turning into fake tattoo sleeves. At the end, where they attach to the chair, I've secured with both sewing and glue 2 powerful magnets. I'll also be sewing magnets to the chair so the wings can be stuck on and easily removed when I need to either put a bag in their place or fold the chair into the back of someone's car. I'm using a lot of glue to secure the parts of the hose I cut to make sure they don't fray or run. And when the structure is solid and dried, I began to dry brush iridescent paint onto the edges of the wings, blending it out toward the center. It doesn't show up quite as iridescent on the pantyhose material as I'd hoped, probably because it's so textured, not a flat and shiny surface to reflect on. However, it's still a good shade of green. When the green gradients had dried, I added veins to the wings with dark brown paint. These wings are modeled after cicada wings, which I tend to use as my favorite fairy wing design. In fact, my Artisona avatar has the same kind of wings, and that is on purpose. My goal in life is to eventually just be my Artisona in real life. I've been using this wheelchair for about a month now, and it has been such a help. There are things that I struggle with. I'm still developing the arm and upper body strength I need to manage uneven footpaths, hills, or getting on and off of buses. And even more than I'd already noticed with my rollator, the wheelchair really makes me see all the things that are inaccessible or just barely accessible enough to be legal, which sucks. On the other hand, using the chair all day in class means that I have the energy to walk home pushing it at the end of the day, and if something goes wrong and I can't stand or balance, I can still get home without having to call a friend to drive me. On days where I can't stand in the evenings, and used to be limited to whatever food I could make in the rice cooker I kept on the floor, I can now wheel myself around the kitchen and use the stove, only needing help with draining pasta or moving full hot pots. I'm hoping to eventually get a chair that actually fits me rather than one so oversized, but for now, this chair is a blessing and I'm so grateful my parents found it for me. There are a couple quirks. One being the brand name plastered on the frame and the backrest. I already don't like the idea of rolling around displaying some company's branding. This is basically an extension of my body when I'm using it, and I don't want to tattoo logos on my skin. But beyond that gripe, who decides to name a company that makes and sells mobility aids Karma? When that little detail was spotted by my friends, we spent a while mocking the idea with disbelieving laughter. Of all the names! I was already going to cover up the logos with my own decorations, but covering up the Karma labeling on the back of the wheelchair was imperative. This chair is henceforth called Another Shrubbery. This is based on my other primary mobility aid, a rollator walker my friends, including the Ravencat gremlin, gifted to me a year ago when I started having balancing and collapsing issues. The walker was proudly named a shrubbery, in reference to Monty Python and the Holy Grail, after I immediately covered the frame with fake vines. And now, this other mobility aid is Another Shrubbery, in reference to the same movie. I embroidered this patch off camera in the evening and sewed it in place with simple whip stitches. The rest of the logos on the chair are covered through the power of foam clay, fake moss, paint, and liquid glue. This first clip, where I modelled the clay mushrooms I'm putting on the chair, was filmed very early in the process, right after I decorated the spokes. However, I decided to group all the process videos of creating the mushrooms together, rather than keeping things in chronological order. I'm not amazingly confident that the mushrooms will stay in place, but I'm hopeful as I position them on purpose in areas of the armrest that aren't interfered with by the brakes, wheels, or armrest lifting mechanism. This next clip has sound, and warning for the sound of an evacuation alarm.
Emergency! Evacuate now. Evacuate as directed. Evacuate as directed.
I just picked up my paint to start painting the shelf mushrooms when the whole apartment building was called to evacuate, and I decided to leave that in my video for fun. Evacuating was not fun, especially as a person who even on my best days cannot make it downstairs without risking collapsing and falling, and who lives halfway up a 12-story building. Luckily, strangers are kind, and sometimes strangers help a creature with a cane by giving them an arm to lean on as they stagger down the stairs. The evac was luckily over fairly quickly. I think a fire extinguisher failed or something. And while shaking, and now definitely using the wheelchair for the rest of the afternoon, I could return to painting my mushrooms. The mushrooms are painted brown as a base, and I then added gills to the underside and a gradient to the top. While the mushrooms dried, I took my paints to the floor to start dabbing green moss-coloured patches to the logos and the areas around them. This is probably the most permanent change I made to the chair, but can probably be scrubbed off with some elbow grease if needed. With all my paint dry, I gathered my mushrooms and some fake moss left over from a project I did in my art course, and began using PVA glue to attach them to the top of the painted patches. I know that PVA glue works well for fake moss when dried, however the moss did not want to stay in place too dry. I eventually figured out that using loosely stuck masking tape would help the moss stay still until the PVA glue could hold it in place. The mushrooms were fine without any help. And with that, the chair is fully decorated, as overgrown as I would like it to be, and possibly the project I am most proud of on this channel, at least recently. Time to reveal it in all its glory. This is my second time recording the outro, as the first time I forgot to turn my mic on. Oops. Anyway, I am so happy with this wheelchair. This is one of my favorite customizations to date. I'm so happy with how it looks and how it feels to use. It feels very me, which is great for a device that I'm using most of the week. And there doesn't seem to be anything about the changes that I made that I would change. I'm actually really happy with everything I did to it, which is honestly rare in customizations. There's usually at least something I wish I had done a little differently. But with this, I think it's as close to perfect as I'm gonna get. Anyway, I don't know when next I'll post because, like I said earlier in the video, I am trying to be a little bit more flexible with my schedule to give me time to figure out how to work around my disabilities. But I'll see you then, and until then, bye!